Not many people know about the importance of stoichiometry and how crucial it may be in order to produce certain everyday objects, such as batteries. Stoichiometry is defined as the relationship between relative quantities of substances taking part in a reaction or forming a compound. For example, 5 hot dogs reacting with 6 hot dog buns will produce 5 products and 1 bun. In this instance, the hot dogs are a limiting factor, or reactant that is totally consumed when the chemical reaction is complete. This pertains to our lab because here we are observing the amounts of products produced with different amounts of reactants, which is potassium hydroxide and copper sulfate. The equation used for this experiment is 2 moles of potassium hydroxide reacting with 1 mole of copper sulfate, which will yield 1 mole of copper hydroxide and 1 mole of potassium sulfate.
The first thing we did was dispense 5 milliliters of copper sulfate into all 8 test tubes. Copper sulfate is the controlled reactant. Next, we added 1 milliliter of potassium hydroxide to test tube 1 and added another milliliter every test tube. Lastly, we calculated how much water needs to be added to each test tube by making sure each test tube adds up to 13 milliliters total. Initially, the first 3 test tubes immediately reacted while test tubes 4 through 8 were still light blue. In the test tubes 1 through 3, copper sulfate became a solid and settled at the bottom, while the potassium hydroxide became a liquid.
By the end of the reaction, we ended with 8 milliliters of precipitant in the first test tube, 7 in the second, 15 in the third, 12 in the fourth, 22 in the sixth, 16 in the seventh, and 16 in the 8th test tube. For tubes 1 through 4, the limiting factor is potassium hydroxide, and then changes to copper sulfate for test tubes 5 through 8.
After we measured our finished reaction and found that the height of precipitate increases in each test tube until it levels off in test tubes 6, 7, and 8. Test tube number 5 has the most precipitate in it at 22 milliliters. This is a graph of the precipitate formed in each test tube. The precipitate is copper hydroxide, and as you can see in the graph, the more potassium hydroxide we put in the beaker, the more precipitate is formed. It did this until test tube number 8, when it levels off.